Christianity and Evolution. The initial title was, Can a Christian Believe in Evolution? I wrote a little pamphlet about that many years ago, 1986. This was with Liguori Publications. This is a much elaboration on it. Since that time, I've been in retreat ministry for 30 years. I just turned 30 years, Heartland Center. How about that? I see sisters in Great Bend. Hi to you all. I miss you. Haven't seen you since the middle of March. I'm married for 43 years, 3 grown children, 6 grandchildren, background in biology, also a writer, a Catholic author with 25 books on prayer, spirituality, and theology. And so I have this background with science and interest in religion, and it's been an ongoing journey to learn how to integrate that. When I first interviewed for work at Heartland Center with Sister Louise Hageman, of course, she was interested in my background in lay ministry and retreat ministry in particular and writing, but she was most interested in my background as a biologist and how I had integrated that and whether we might do some biology things at the retreat center, like bird watching retreats and trips and workshops and lectures. And we have, through the years, done all of that and enjoyed it very much. Okay, now our paid commercial here coming up. Ministry support. There was no registration fee for this webinar, as you know. But here is an online donation link, or you can send a support check to Heartland Center for Spirituality in Great Bend. Put internet support on it. We have closed our doors to presenting programs and retreats since mid-March. So these kinds of online outreaches are what we've been doing, along with online spiritual direction, hoping we can eventually open to the public again. We'll see how that goes, when that will happen. The goals for tonight, we're going to have presentation for maybe 50 to 60 minutes. I'll see how far I get. And then we'll take a break of about 5 minutes, and you will be able to ask questions using that attendee chat, or on the top menu bar, there's one that has like a quote bubble, and you can type your question into the text box in the quote bubble, which comes to me and not to the whole group. So our first issue we're going to look at is, what do we mean by evolution? That's often people mean all kinds of things by that. How does evolution explain adaptations? That's its main focus. We'll talk about evolution as theory versus hypothesis or law. You know, many times people will say, well, evolution is, quote, just a theory. A theory in science is a pretty big, so we'll talk about what that means. What degree of acceptance does evolution have in Christianity? And what are some alternative explanations for adaptations and diversity that we find going on nowadays? We'll look at 4 different perspectives, 4 different explanatory perspectives, and then finally raise the question, where is God in the evolutionary process? And by the end of that, we'll be handing over to the next webinar next month on what does it mean to be pro-life. We'll have set the stage, so I'll tell you a little more about that when we get there. So that might sound like a lot, but we'll be racing through this. I have over 100 academic hours of credit in this material that will be summarized very briefly and somewhat superficially, but I think most of you probably already have an understanding of evolution, or just wanting to dig a little deeper into it, especially its connections with theology and spirituality. And I think we can get somewhere with that tonight. So let's talk about evolution as a theory. What do we mean by the theory of evolution? What is this about? Evolution is an explanation for how life has diversified. How do we get all these different kind of critters? It's not an explanation for the origin of the universe. Evolution needs a universe that already exists. So we're not talking about atheism, like an alternative explanation to how the universe began or anything like that. It's focused on changes in heritable characteristics of populations through successive generations. So the primary focus of evolution, study of evolution, is usually populations. And granted, populations are comprised of individuals, but what's going on in populations and how do populations pass along inheritable material from one generation to the next? Now, if anytime we mention the term evolution, what's the first name that comes to mind? I can't hear you. Right, Charles Darwin. On the Origin of the Species, 1859. His um, groundbreaking book, still considered foundational, um, as just the beginning of a comprehensive, congruent explanation of this theory of evolution. It's based largely on his travels, observations, and notes. It was not a new idea, however. There were others who had been working with this idea. Another man whose name is famous here is Alfred Russel Wallace. In 1858, he and Darwin presented together a paper to the Linnean Society in London on the tendency of species to form varieties. And what's really cool about the internet is you can actually read that paper, the paper that they read to the Linnean Society. So, as Darwin was writing his book, he has all this documentation. He finds out about Wallace and that Wallace is planning to do this paper. So they worked very well together instead of as competitors, like, hey, this is my idea. No, this is my idea. It was an idea that was already floating around, but Darwin was the one who really gave it some meat, you might say, who really anchored it in the data. The linchpin for evolutionary theory, the way that it works, is the process called natural selection. This is how diversification happens. And so it goes like this. There's an excess of individuals produced in a population, more than can survive to maturity. So every day, most every day, sometime in the afternoon, I take a walk around a lake that is close to our house. And I've been watching the ducks from their hatching the little ones to their growth. And one group in particular started with about 10 baby ducks. And on my walk yesterday, it was down to 3. So what happened to the other 7? Well, they, you might say, were part of that excess of individuals. They didn't make it for one reason or another, and sometimes it's just a matter of bad luck. Variation in adaptable traits among individuals in a population. So not everybody's the same. And you look at these giraffes in the picture on the top left. So one's a little shorter, one's kind of medium, one's longer. So there's variation. You'll see that in a litter of puppies or cats, that some are big and strong, and others are kind of, we call them runts. So some are a little more adapted to survive than others. They come into this world with a lot going for them, and they're right out of the gate. And some are lucky too. Well, what about our giraffes? Well, one of them can reach leaves on this branch, the other 2 cannot. So if most of the branches in the trees are kind of high up, this tall guy is going to be the one that is more adapted to survive than the others. And that's a very simplistic demonstration, but that's kind of how it goes. And those individuals that survive to maturity can pass their genetic material along to the next generation. Now, Darwin did not know about genetic material, but he knew that heredity happened. I mean, the human race had been breeding animals together to form better strains for a long time. We'd gone from wolves to chihuahuas. Chihuahuas come from wolves, yeah. And so we knew that we could see changes happening in an animal group and in plant groups. We got better strains of wheat and corn by crossing them together. So we knew about heredity and about changes that happen to heredity. And evolution is putting some structure to that. In nature, variation, genetic variation, happens in several different ways. The first one, sexual reproduction, is the most common form in the higher animals and plants for shuffling the genetic material. So the female has her genetic material and the male has genetic material. And when their seeds come together, there's a crossing over. He gets half of hers and she gets half his in the new seed or egg. And so you have a new combination of genetic material. It's a great adaptive development. Otherwise, we're just making copies of ourselves. But here you come up with some variety. This shift happened about 1.2 billion years ago. So sexual reproduction has been around a long time. Another way is called mutations, that we get varieties of, let's see, oh, how about that? That's crossing a light bulb with an ice cream cone. We get one of these newfangled light bulbs. Mutations are changes in the DNA that are passed along. The DNA is found in the nucleus of the cell. It's where the genetic material is found, the gene code. Scientists have really mapped the human gene code, the DNA in humans. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and each of those chromosomes is a long strand of DNA. So there's a lot of material there. And sometimes the DNA is affected by pollution, by radiation. So there might be a segment on the DNA that is either destroyed or maybe some reversal in the way the chemicals on the DNA are lined up. Mutations are usually harmful. Sometimes they're just neutral. They don't make a difference one way or the other. But that's another way we get variability. Another one is called chromosomal aberrations. This would be an error that happens in the cell division process or even in the process of sexual reproduction when the genetic material is being exchanged. Part of a chromosome might break up or a part might break off in the middle and then turn around. And so things are all linked up in different ways. Usually, again, mutations and chromosomal aberrations are disadvantageous. Sometimes, however, stroke of luck, they just happen to be the right kind of change that makes all the difference. So let's see how this works in a population. So here we have a typical bell-shaped curve. And what this bell-shaped curve represents is the amount of variation in a population of, let's say, mice, since I studied mice. So let's say this bell-shaped curve represents the variation of their tolerance to certain pollution, certain pollutants, okay? So with any bell-shaped curve, you have the highest numbers in the middle and on either sides of the middle. And then on either extreme, like the 1 or 2% on either extreme, are kind of on the margins. They're not well adapted at all. They can maybe survive, but they won't do well. The ones that do well are the ones that are closest to the middle. Let's say, however, something happens and there begins to be some pollution happening, more and more pollution in the atmosphere. And so pollution is exerting some kind of stress on this population. And so that's what we call selection pressure. The pressure becoming more polluted in time is acting more and more on this population, so that on the left side of that curve are not well adapted to the new atmosphere and its pollution. So what will eventually happen over time is a shifting in the population to accommodate that change. So there you see the mice that were sort of maladapted in the original bell-shaped curve. Those on the right, the 1 or 2%, they're now in the middle. They're the most adapted. Now this might have taken, let's say, 20,000 years to happen. So a population has a lot of time to get used to that idea. Those that were in the middle in the original population are not doing so good anymore. They're barely hanging on. So that's an example of how environmental stress shifts a population and causes some kind of evolution to happen. Right? So keep that in mind. Environmental stress, one way in which the genetic variability is selected in a population differently over time. So you see a change in characteristics of that population, a population here that can do a little bit better with pollution. Here's an example of that, the peppered moths in England, Biston betularia. The original, okay, in the left-hand picture, there are two moths. You might not be able to see the original form. It's on the right-hand side of the bark. If you look real close, you can see it. It blends in, doesn't it? But you see the dark form just stands out. And if you're a woodpecker and you like moths, guess which one you're going to notice, and so you're going to eat it. So prior to the Industrial Revolution and in places where there's not a lot of pollution in England, the dark form just sticks out. The light form blends in quite well. But in other parts where pollution has taken place, there's that dark form on the right-hand picture. He's at the bottom. Can you see him on the bark? Barely, right? But the peppered one, the lighter one, stands out. So what you saw happening in England with the Industrial Revolution was the shifting in the population from the light peppered form to the dark form. So the dark form eventually predominated. Here's another way that variation happens in populations and even leads to new species. So this is a geographical location, a nice round space. And maybe let's say it's a big island, okay? And there's a species of mice that inhabits the whole island. And so they, through various family group linkages, the genetic material is flowing all around in this island. They're one species group. But then at some point, a river begins to flow through the island, and they can kind of make it across, so they don't have a problem with that. But then the river gets bigger and bigger, and they can't. So what you end up with is two populations, one on either side of the river. Now they're geographically isolated. And if that goes on for hundreds, thousands of years, eventually what you'll get is what Darwin and Wallace were talking about, subspecies, a new variant. So there's one subspecies on one side of the river and another one on the other side of the river. Now, subspecies belong to the same species, means if you would get them back together in the right conditions and, their offspring would still be fertile. They belong to the same kind of species. But here's the other problem. They might not really like each other, and they might not want to mate, because that can happen too. So sometimes subspecies are pretty close genetically, but they just don't get along. They're close to becoming two different species. And if you kept them apart for many, many more years, they would eventually become two separate gene pools that, even if you get rid of the river, they would maintain themselves as two different species in the wild. When I went to LSU, I saw this. Baton Rouge is right about where that the foot begins to extend from the boot. I grew up in south central Louisiana where the uh, Delta fox squirrel was common, Sciurus niger subaratus. This is the squirrels we would hunt. They're kind of small, mostly reddish. There's a dark form. And went to LSU, there's this huge subspecies, Sciurus niger bachmanii, on the east side of the river. In fact, my major professor named it. He found it to be not only different from the Delta fox squirrel, but from one that was a little further to the east. It's a big squirrel. It's got a white nose, a black face. I mean, you want to say, wow, it's a whole different animal, but it's still Sciurus niger. It's still the same species. If in the right conditions, the Delta fox squirrel and the Bachman fox squirrel would get together on some blind date and get drunk, they might be able to have fertile offspring. In fact, they would have fertile offspring because they are part of the same species. So this is what it looks like in action. And it's the Mississippi River that keeps them apart. Mississippi is a huge river. And along the Florida coast, there are all these little beach mice on different islands. And each of them are a little bit different. They're all different subspecies of Paramiscus polianotus. Now, the main one is the brown one at the bottom right. And so sometime years ago, when the oceans were lower, then the brown one was the predominant species, and it was found all throughout the area. But then as the water rose, little populations were trapped on the islands and isolated from the others, and they diversified to blend in with the different kinds of sand. They're all considered one species. If after a few more thousands of years, they might even become whole new species. So this is, you might say, evolution in action. And here's the big picture of it. This is the huge thing. Let me get down to my notes here. On the left are what we call prokaryotes, and the green branch on the right are eukaryotes. That's our family. These are called domains. And so we're used to talking about plant kingdom, animal kingdom. Those are eukaryotes. What's the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes? Well, prokaryotes are like bacteria, and the archaea are protobacteria. They have a very simple strand of DNA. They're single cells. They're found all over the place. They're found in our gut. They're found in the soil. I mean, the earth wouldn't function without them. The eukaryotes have, additionally, they've got the DNA wrapped around a nucleus. A nucleus holds the DNA, and there's usually much more DNA in the eukaryotes. The eukaryotes are the animals, the fungi, and the plants. But you see where our family trees come together a very long time ago. Like these prokaryotes got going around maybe 3 billion years ago. Scientists estimate that life began on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago and diversified from some very simple common ancestors into these three domains, and then they all branched out in different ways as well. So that's kind of how they look at it now. You might have seen pictures like this. Well, where are the prokaryotes in this picture? The artist doesn't think much of them, so they're the two little blue leaves at the bottom of the chart. The artist is much more interested in the tree of life for eukaryotes. All right, so then what's the evidence for evolution? Well, I've just been showing you some of it, that life does in fact diversify through time because of geographic isolation, because of mutations, because of shifts in the environment, populations change. We see that happening. It's not something we're making up. This is just observation. So one evidence, too, is that structures shared by present and past life forms suggest a common ancestor. And intermediate forms are found in the fossil records. Now, the thing about fossil records is The amazing thing about fossil record is that we have any fossils at all. Uh, for an animal to die and leave a record of its life, whether bones or footprint or something, so that we can still see it today, is amazing. It's quite rare. It takes perfect conditions for that to happen. And yet we do see quite a few fossils with some intermediate forms between what we have today and what was around way back then. Natural selection is observed today, it's still found. Um, and here's the big one. The evidence for evolution is um, everything seems to depend on DNA. Life on Earth comes from one kind of source. There weren't like multiple kinds of life. There's carbon-based life that uses DNA to propagate itself. It might not be like that on other planets. There might be some other kinds of life that aren't carbon-based and that don't use something like DNA. Um, who knows? Genome studies show commonalities and divergences, like there's 99% or higher correspondence between human DNA and chimpanzees' DNA, which is pretty remarkable. Um, but it can be a very small thing, like it can be a change in the vocal cords, in the way of vocalization, and the ability to make more sophisticated sounds that makes better communication possible, that grows the brain in new ways. I mean, all kinds of things can be just a very small mutation that brings about a huge change in an animal and a population. So there's a lot of evidence for evolution. So that's why it's so widely accepted. Three words, we said we'd look at: hypothesis, theory, and law. A hypothesis is a limited explanation pending further investigation and verification. So if we wanted to find out if the little beach mice were different species or whether they're just subspecies, we might move a few from one island onto another island, and we might, put some more, we might mix them up on different islands to see what happens and formulate some hypotheses and watch and see what they actually do. Will they maintain their distinct groupings, or will they interbreed? That you have to test. A theory is an in-depth explanation of a wide variety of phenomena. So it's not just looking at one thing to try to test it. It's kind of moving toward philosophy, a way of connecting a lot of different dots together. And then there's law. A law is a verifiable description, usually mathematical, of natural phenomenon. And I like the way this compares scientific theory and scientific law. Theories explain why phenomena occur. Laws describe what phenomena happen. What is the phenomenon? How does it happen? And they both, though, reach repeated successful predictions. They have strong explanatory power, you might say. Evolution as a theory, I think you all know who this is. Pope John Paul II. At his message to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences meeting to explore the topic on evolution in 1996. And part of his message to them is, it is remarkable that this theory has had progressive influence on the spirit of researchers following a series of discoveries in different scholarly disciplines. The convergence in the results of these independent studies, which was neither planned nor sought, constitutes in itself a significant argument in favor of the theory. What is the significance of a theory such as this one? To open this question is into the field of epistemology. Epistemology is how we know what we know. A theory is a meta-scientific elaboration which is distinct from, but in harmony with, the results of observation. With the help of such a theory, a group of data and independent facts are related to one another and interpreted in one comprehensive explanation. So it ties a lot of things together: genetics, variation, population dynamics, and so forth. The theory proves its validity by the measure to which it can be verified. It is constantly being tested against the facts. When it can no longer explain these facts, it shows its limits and its lack of usefulness must then be revised. And the theory of evolution has been tweaked or revised. It's a little different from what Darwin and Wallace presented to the Linnaean Society. The main flow of it, the main form of it is still there, but there have been some tweaks. In other words, does the Catholic Church accept evolution? Well, yes. Let's see what Christianity did. It was a mixed reaction. Some in Christianity saw Darwin and the Origin of the Species, his book, as being incompatible with Christianity, not always for good intellectual reasons. It was considered offensive to, think that we had ape-like ancestors. And some funny stories about that we don't have time to get into. There was, however, already a recognition among many, especially in the scientific community, that the Earth was very old. I mean, they'd seen fossils. They knew fossils had, been deposited many, many years ago. They weren't recent at all. They could tell that the rocks were very, very old. They were beginning to have different, accurate ways of dating them. And as I mentioned earlier, they were also breeding animals and seeing changes in animals as you interbreed them. Same with plants as well. It wasn't a surprise that Darwin was saying there's variation and it changes according to the needs of the population in the response to the environment. There was already a recognition that Genesis and other works were metaphoric, poetic, mythic expressions of revelation in many churches. Not all, but some were already moving in that direction of contextual and other forms of interpreting scripture. So they didn't have a big problem with it. Then Darwin himself was a theist. He was not hostile to religion at all. He struggled especially with the problem of evil and how evolutionary theory and the way things happen just looks kind of impersonal, and that still is a struggle for us. The way animals eat each other and use each other and all, it's like, whoa. Evolution and Christian faith. Looking at Christianity as a whole, a large number of Christian groups have no problem theologically with evolution. They see no conflict. Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Episcopal, ELCA, Lutheran, Presbyterian, UCC, you can read them all. The Catholic Church teaching, which I'm most familiar with and written about all the way back to 1986 in the little pamphlet, accepts the evolution of the body in the way that science explains, but insists that the spiritual soul is created directly by God, that something spiritual can't be explained in terms of matter. And so the body and its development happened according to evolution, but God infuses the soul at the moment of conception. That's the teaching for now, at least, and probably will be. It's been pretty steady all along. Some degree of conflict: Missouri Synod Lutherans, Southern Baptists, some evangelicals. Some of them have alternatives to evolution that they present and even want taught in the schools. Creation science, intelligent design being the two most common. A Pew survey in 2015 found that in Americans as a whole, 31% of the population doubt evolution, but 65% accept it. And I guess the others aren't quite sure, the 4% or so. Among Catholics, it's 27% doubt evolution. 70% accepted. Mainline Protestants is 25-73, but evangelicals is 60-36. So they are having the biggest struggle. And of course, evangelical is a very broad term. It includes a wide variety of different kinds of Christian groups. Usually here we're talking about non-denominational groups, not affiliated with any particular denomination, gathered around a charismatic preacher. Maybe there's affiliations, among different communities that um, join together for educational and other purposes. But it's higher in those groups to struggle with evolution and even to reject it outright. They're the ones that propose these alternatives. Here's a picture from this Creation Museum. I think that's what this one is called. Um, yeah, and so see anything wrong with that picture? There's a dinosaur and a human in it. Well, there is no way, except if you're a creationist, then you don't believe the earth is any older than 10,000 years, and so somehow dinosaurs were around the same time as humans, and they got killed with the flood or some other way. There's different kinds of creationism, but they're very closely linked to the Genesis account of creation. Intelligent design is a little different. It's again strongly related to and connected with the Genesis account, but it's a little more open to scientific explanation. It uses what's called irreducible complexity, like some things we find in nature couldn't have evolved. They're just too complex. I mean, can you really have an eye? I mean, what's the purpose of an eye? It's to see. So what is an intermediate form of an eye if it doesn't see? How does that happen? They pose these rhetorical questions that generally evolutionary scientists have a quick and easy response to. Well, it's light sensitive. There are advantages to that, and so forth. The problem is in some states that they have a very strong voice in politics and want these kinds of alternative explanations taught in the schools. Louisiana, where I grew up, was one such state, and I moved to Kansas, and just my luck, Kansas wanted it taught here as well. I wrote a few letters about that. I don't think they made any difference because it turned out to be the law for a while. That where evolution was taught, you had to teach intelligent design as an alternative, and eventually we moved to a place where we didn't have to do that anymore. The core issues are how we look at Genesis. Is it a scientific document or not? No, most even biblical scholars say it's a weaving together of stories about creation that were told and sung. It's not meant to be a scientific text. However, it is a message that tells us something about God, a good God, who is the creator of a good creation. And that was very, very different from the cultures in that area. It also accounts for the human place in the creation. The core issue, again, is that theology and science are different kinds of explanation. So here's 4 different kinds of explanation. They constitute what we might call interdisciplinary boundaries or levels. They're all different. They're dealing with different kinds of topics in different kinds of ways. I'll run through it. Positivism, you might say, is science. It's looking at what is measurable and observable, physics, chemistry, biology, even psychology. It helps us to understand the natural world. So really, science can't tell us anything about God. That's not its province. God is not measurable and observable. But when scientists hear some Christians saying the earth is only 6,000 years old, they go, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not true. Physics tells us it's much older than that, and this is why we believe physics, and they'll give you the explanation. Philosophical explanations are looking at ethics, metaphysics, a different set of questions in philosophy, a different set of questions in theology, which is trying to understand createdness and contingency in relation to a creator. So where ultimately do things come from, and how are the things that exist related to their ultimate cause? That's one very basic theological question. And then within theology, you have all these other kinds of questions, especially within a religion like Christianity, about who is Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and so forth. And finally, theotic explanations. Here's mystical theology, helping us to understand human transformation in the spirit. Well, science can't tell us anything about that, but it leans on theology, which kind of leans on philosophy, and so forth. So, different kinds of explanations for different kinds of concerns and different constraints. Um, a problem when I was in biology is I did have professors who were saying things about theology that were completely inappropriate. And it's equally inappropriate for people in theology to say things about science. So science and theology have different explanatory concerns, and we need to respect the boundaries of each. Theology cannot affirm as false something that science affirms as true. So it's not like there's one kind of truth here and another kind of truth there. There are different kinds of uh, truth concerns, but you can't say this is true only if this is false. If it's true here, then it has to be true in another context as well. So in a way, science actually constrains theology. In some senses, it does. So theology can't say that, God made everything all at once and it's been there, everything has been there from the beginning. That's a statement that science can prove is false. Some things are no longer here. Some things that are here now have only been here recently. Science has no business venturing into theological speculation, and philosophy is a bridge between science and theology. It's sort of the in between place for them. Well, now that we got all that straight, we can take a closer look at the universe from the divine perspective and say, what's really going on here? Why did the divine decide to do it like this? What is all this telling us about God? Well, one thing you can say is remember, evolution starts with a universe that already exists. But it could be that God created a universe that is capable of producing complex molecules in life. So, sort of like it's all kind of baked into the way the universe is made. And if that's true, we can expect to find life and all kinds of interesting phenomena in other planets. And scientists believe there are probably millions of planets just in our galaxy that are capable of sustaining life. In other words, their position in relation to their sun. Um, some of them look as though they have water based on the light profile that's emanating from them. So who knows what's out there? Wouldn't it be wonderful? Well, I think we'll know in heaven. God is the creator and sustainer of creatures. So this is theology here. Theology says that creatures don't exist except God wills their existence and sustains their existence. That creatures depend on God for their existence in a universe that God has created, out of which their existence has arisen. So there is always this lifeline between the creature and God that is part of the universe story, at least from the Christian perspective. God makes creatures that are variously endowed with intelligence and freedom. Now, granted, in a human, we understand that, but even in lower life forms, even in lower non-living forms, there's a certain kind of interiority in them, even if it's a chemical interiority, that can respond to different kind of influences. So relationality is built into this universe. All creatures are intimately related to one another and interdependently interactive. Takes a while to unpack that one. What that's sort of the basis of ecology, studying our relatedness, our dependence on one another, how our interactions with each other influence each other. In other words, we all come from something in common. We've all grown up as these kind of brothers and sisters to each other. Everything we see around us that's alive, that was created, even the things we've created out of that, are related in some ways. The divine interacts with creation in the context of its creaturely lawfulness. Ah, in other words, God lets us be who we are and tries to influence us within that context. So, one way of summarizing this, I think St. Paul kind of had he didn't know about Darwin, but he knew we lived in a kind of a universe that was dynamic. This wonderful saying from Romans 8:22, this is the way the Jerusalem Bible puts it, and it's my favorite way of putting it. From the beginning till now, the entire creation, as we know, has been groaning in one great act of giving birth. That's kind of what we're talking about, isn't it? I mean, you think of those prokaryotes, you know, all these trees of life. One great act of giving birth has happened on this planet and really probably throughout the whole universe. I love that question in Star Trek. What's out there? Um, you know what these are? These are galaxies. That's what they are. Every little dot you see there is a galaxy. And every one of those galaxies has billions of stars. And how many planets in each of those galaxies is capable of sustaining some kind of life? There are billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars. So, yeah, what's out there? One way of reflecting on evolution that's, I think, become pretty popular during this time, and we'll look at it quickly and then take a break, is process theology. Now, there are some forms of process theology that are not compatible with Christianity or these other forms of religion. They posit a God who is evolving, who's using the universe to evolve God's self. Those kinds don't usually hold up uh, with other parts of Christian theology, but they do. There are some forms of process theology that talk about God's relationship with the creation as a kind of a courtship. God makes this creation that has creatures that have some degrees of freedom. And so God can interact with the creation in a relationship and influence the bringing forth of the creation relationally. So Teilhard de Chardin was kind of a pioneer. Some of his stuff is holding up well. Some of it has kind of been debunked. The Divine Milieu would be a great book to read if you're interested in him. He's a Jesuit priest. Teilhard was also a paleontologist. My all-time favorite is Dennis Edwards' Partaking of God, which looks at St. Athanasius' theology and posits a Trinitarian relationship between, so God is related to the creation as Trinity, as the Father beyond, as the Son with us, and the Spirit within us, and how God brings the creation along as in a Trinitarian context. Ilia Delio is very popular these days. The Humility of God is her newest book. Well, one of her newest. Maybe she has a new one. I don't know. She has a lot of books, but that's one that I think really brings forth the idea of a God who is humble enough to work with creation as it is and gently lead it forth. A God who feels what creation feels as well as one of the contributions of process. John Haught, Jack Haught, as he goes by Jack, when I lived in Baton Rouge, I had him over for a weekend to do some talks, and we got to be fast friends. His book, The Cosmic Adventure, is a real classic on process theology, on Christian theology, and reflecting on evolution. His newest I have not read, but I'm sure it's good, Making Sense of Evolution, God, Darwin, and the Drama of Life. And I know many of you know Elizabeth Johnson from some of her other books, but she's now into process. Her newest book, one of her newest, Ask the Beasts, Darwin, and the God of Love. So that's some continuing reading that you can do if this topic interests you. Might just conclude this part by taking a look at Teilhard, some slides I put together for when we were doing our Spirit Life program. Teilhard, as a paleontologist, looked at evolution and saw life branching out in all different directions, but there's one particular direction that showed an increase of complexity, neural complexity in brain matter, and consciousness. And so he tracked this. So here's some terms that Teilhard uses. Omega point, you might think of the word, the logos, who from whom God creates, through whom God creates all things. It's sort of God's presence bringing forth the creation, plotting it against time. And there's this period where matter is becoming complexified as it combines with itself in all kinds of novel ways in the seas and whatnot. He calls that geogenesis. Geogenesis, matter becoming more complex. And then at some point, a threshold is crossed and life emerges. And life is a new kind of thing. It's not just a complex molecule, it's a new kind of phenomenon. It can sustain itself, it can respond to the environment, it can reproduce itself. It's adaptive. It's not just matter, it's living matter. And it becomes more complex through time, influenced by the divine presence within and before it, leading it forward. Teilhard called that developmental period biogenesis, the ongoing development of the biosphere. The biosphere is now a new thing. It's the sphere of life, the sphere of life that has the physical universe as its foundation. Then comes a new kind of an emergence, humans. At some point in time, actually, they figure somewhere around 130,000 years ago, a new kind of creature emerged in the order Primates, class Mammalia, all of that. You can situate it there, but it's different from the rest. Um, a creature that is conscious of its consciousness and begins to operate not just in the biosphere, but in a new realm Teilhard called the noosphere, the realm of the mind, that we begin to create a culture that is our home just as much as the earth is. We live in a milieu of ideas, not just a milieu of oxygen and, food and stuff like that. We're biological creatures. We have that as our foundation. It's part of our infrastructure, but there's a new emergence that happens there. Homogenesis. The human breakthrough is of a new interior subjectivity, a presence to oneself as the experiencer of one's experiences and the doer of one's actions. Now, we don't really know if animals have that, but it doesn't look like they do. They have some interior freedom, but not awareness of themselves as agents of their own acts of freedom, acts of knowledge. So they are just kind of responding to an environment. In the human, and one of the coolest statements I ever came across, and I forget where, is that in the human, the universe and evolution have become conscious of itself. Wow, the first time I heard that, it gave me, in French we call it the frissons, the chills. And it still does, kind of like, it's sort of like evolution awakening to its own reality in a being who can consciously relate to it and understand it. And so that's a new kind of creature and a new kind of position in the cosmos. There might be many, many others like that too. This human breakthrough has a vast adaptability, not just genetic. It can change its environment to suit itself. It wears clothes, it makes homes, fires, crops, medicine. It basically lives everywhere on this planet except the most extreme places. It can make itself home. And so nothing else quite like that. So then we find human biology unfolding henceforth in the noosphere, the realm of the mind. What is it that influences life on Earth most at this time? The way the human mind is operating. It's affecting the whole creation, the whole ecology. Other plants, other animals are now being influenced by the noosphere, directly and indirectly influencing the whole of creation. Okay, we got one more rung to go. In Teilhard's perspective, at a certain time in history, another kind of creature emerges, a special kind of creature out of the human race. the Christ himself is born. And so human nature then is foundational to the Christ. He is God made man. Um, and that happened, we know, around 2,000 years ago, if we're dating it. And it introduces a whole new kind of um, milieu in which the creation is unfolding, the pneumatosphere, or the sphere or realm of the spirit. So then the human mind is in the noosphere, now unfolds within the pneumatosphere in a new way, and the biosphere unfolds within that. You see where this is all going in this string here. And it happens because of Jesus Christ, the Word who became flesh and dwelt among us, incarnation. A new mediation of divine presence through Jesus to the noosphere, through the noosphere, and all of creation. It's appropriated by human individuals whose humanity is left intact, free to accept or reject the gift that is offered. And there we have faith and baptism and love and other spiritual gifts. And so what happens, and it hasn't happened yet, we know, not completely, is the transformation of this noosphere, the realm of the mind that human beings all participate in, our cultures, our societies, and all of that. A transformation of the noosphere in the spirit of Jesus, and through that noosphere, all of creation as well, through our relationship, our new relationship with it. That is theosis. So eventually, God is all in all, as Paul would say. That's where ultimately it's all going, and who knows when that will be. What we can say is it's not now. It hasn't happened yet. We're in between the already and the not yet, somewhere in between. So creation will be freed, like us, from its slavery to decadence to enjoy the same freedom and glory as the children of God. One more very brief slide to show the completion of that, of how that pneumatosphere cascades down through the realm of the mind, through the biosphere, all the way, into the physical creation itself, is renewed through that man Jesus and his gift of spirit as appropriated through his church and spread out through all these other relationships to the whole world, and who knows, maybe one day even beyond. Use spiritual principles from process theology then. Change is normal, the way of the universe. Be open to change and growth. I love the saying, change is a constant. And it's true. It's a paradoxical saying, isn't it? Change is a constant. Humans are, with God, co-creators of the universe. Accept your high calling. God's influence and guidance is through loving appeal to our freedom and intelligence. Be attentive to love's invitation. So this is the spirituality that flows from all this complicated stuff I've been talking about. And finally, when we cooperate with God's loving power, we help to build the universe. So be intelligent, reasonable, responsible in exercising your freedom. So there we go, right? Almost on time, top of the hour here. And so what I would uh, suggest we do now is take a little break of, let's say, 5 minutes, during which time you can type your questions into the attendee chat, or the questions for the instructor in the little quote bubble at the top. And questions or comments can be about anything, okay? And you can type them in another application and then copy paste them in there if that's a little easier than typing in that little box. So I'll check that out when I come back from the break, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. We have a question. Something I struggle with is, at what point in the evolutionary process did beings become sentient, or I guess develop a soul, so we can say the many variants of hominid species were sentient or just Homo sapiens? Yeah, I That's one, of course, that has an interface between philosophy and science. So if philosophy would ask the question like, what is the evidence of sentience? How would we be able to tell if a being is sentient or not? If it um, understood itself to be an agent of its own actions, uh, conscious of itself as an agent of responsibility. And I've never found a good, clear answer to that. I mean, there's no universal consensus about that. I guess the closest it comes is sometimes they'll say art, that art, the evidence that hominids, or, and to my knowledge, there are no hominids besides Homo sapiens that have developed art. Now, I could be wrong about that. It always depends on whether Neanderthalensis is a subspecies or a separate species, and increasingly it's being called a subspecies. Um, but art presupposes the ability of a being to represent its internal reality externally. And so, in that sense, it's different from tool making, which you find in some very primitive forms, even in birds. And of course, the apes do this all the time. So that's not quite the same thing. Tool making is pragmatic, adaptive, but art is some sort of inner representation of my relationship with my environment, my appreciation of my environment. And everywhere we find that, it's, you know, clearly Homo sapiens doing it. And I'm not aware, maybe some of you are if you type it in, of how much of that is present in the Neanderthal communities. If there's much art from that, I could ask my buddy here. Okay, Google, did the Neanderthals have art?
According to National Geographic, cave paintings found in Spain are first known Neanderthal art. In a cave in Spain, scientists found this ladder shape made of red horizontal and vertical lines.
64,000 years ago, Neanderthals. So that's well within the emergence of Homo sapiens. So there you have it. Neanderthals were doing this too. Maybe not as elaborately, lines, but how did they get there? Somebody put them there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the best I can do with it. Um, and granted that even in human populations today, we see varying degrees of this new kind of interiority and consciousness. You don't see a lot of it, for example, in little children at first. Not until they're around a year and a half to 2 years old do you start seeing them, maybe a little before that, aware of themselves as the doer of their actions and not just part of the milieu. So um, they're waking up as they grow up more and more. So, very good question. Um, Anything else? Covered a lot of ground here. Did the material on how evolution happens and the examples, did that make sense? Maybe I'll go to the attendee list and look for some thumbs up on that. If the part on explaining evolution and how evolution happens, how adaptation through geographic isolation, population drift. Oh, there's one thumbs up drifting across here. Um, just kind of give you a flavor for that, how that happens. Yeah. Did the part about different arenas of explanation, did that make sense? Positivist, philosophical, theistic, theotic. How did that come across? Is that okay? Makes sense? Okay. All right. Then let's see what else. Well, Teilhard de Chardin's levels of emergence, geogenesis, biogenesis, homogenesis, Christogenesis, a lot of material. That makes sense? It's a funny thing that Teilhard, I was in preparing for this, looking up some uh, new material on Teilhard. I'm going to go backwards in my slides. And so I'm looking up Teilhard, and I type in Teilhard de Chardin's stages of emergence, and there in the Google results is this picture right here, this image that I'm looking at. I'm saying, how did that end up on the internet? I taught that to a group of people at Heartland Center for Spirituality in Great Bend several years ago. And there it is. Some professor is using it with his paper. Now, it didn't have my name on it, my name on the bottom left there. I put that since. So I looked him up and I contacted him and I said, uh, so I'm the guy that created this. And I said, and that's fine with me that you used it. From now on, please use this one instead, which has my name. But I said, I really want to know how you found it. And he said, oh, some other guy sent it to me. That's no help. I said, who is this other guy? He says, well, I don't remember. So, you never know how your stuff ends up getting around the world, but it does sometimes. So he thought this was a great illustration of Teilhard's stages of emergence and how one new level transforms the next, but how the lower levels are foundational for the higher and so forth. So he said he'd give me credit anytime he used it from now on. This is a kind of an art form for me, doing these kinds of slides. It's a meditation, putting things visually, showing their relationships. It's an image concept, I call it, just to visually show these relationships, put it down. I very much enjoy doing that. I know a few years ago, I was talking to a man who was very much a creationist. A creation, he was a fundamentalist, but he wasn't a 100% convinced creationist. He liked evolution too. And I pointed out that in Genesis, in the days of creation, and I forget what day it is, maybe 4, it says, let the earth bring forth every living thing. And I said, isn't that a good statement of evolution? And he says, well, it sure is. Problem solved. There it was for him right in the Bible. And I'm sure the author of Genesis was not talking about evolution when he says, let the earth bring forth every living creature. But it's a kind of a statement that can be interpreted that way, and for some people can make a difference. So you might look that one up too, see what day of creation that's on. A few more things showing up in attendee chat, which you can all look at too. Some thumbs up. Please speak about possible Christian perspectives on the Big Bang Theory, which is science that is more closely related to creation than to evolution. Well, that's the term that's still used. I heard it used the other day in a documentary that was talking about quantum physics. And quantum physics is where some of our understanding of creation begins to get a little fuzzy. We've tended to think of creation as you just keep going, you're getting smaller and smaller stuff, molecules, atoms, quarks, and all that. But quantum physics shows a real fuzzy edge to creation, but it still doesn't seem to explain the origins of creation. It looks as though the universe is expanding. And if you reverse the expanding universe, you go the other way, it all moves toward a single point, a singularity, they call it, a point in time from which everything started expanding. So that's still the understanding. Now, nobody knows how that happened, why that happened. I don't think anybody knows that. Some kind of an interplay between matter and antimatter. But in the first few split seconds of that Big Bang explosion, the lawfulness of the universe the four laws, the four forces that govern the way the universe functions, they were set. The balance was set in that time. And in that little bit of time, the way galaxies formed and the way supernova exploded and created matter and all of that, that was all put into motion in that first split second. So what was there before the Big Bang? I don't think anybody really knows. Um, and if they did, they would have to ask the question, well, what was there before that? So ultimately, createdness keeps pushing the question back to um, a, a, a primary cause. Um, so I hope that answers that question. Another one, this may be a simplistic understanding, but comparing this to Genesis, God created the universe and all things in it, but it was not in 7 days, rather more like billions of years. And God's creation took place in the Big Bang. Before that, there was only a huge void. Yeah, yeah, I think we're still kind of tempted to see, well, how might we be able to stretch Genesis to connect with our understanding of modern science, and some people have done that. Days doesn't mean 24 hours; it can mean a long period of time. Um, what the biblical scholars have done, they haven't taken that approach. Their approach has been to help us to understand what is being articulated in that creation story. And I wish I had my friend Jerry, who was with me in the last webinar, to say something about that. But you know, Genesis 1 to 3 is at least two creation stories that are woven together. Well, I mean, chapter 1 has a creation story, then there's another creation story, different traditions that are kind of woven together. These were oral traditions that were finally written down, and they were probably memorized as parts of prayers or songs. That's how you did it in an oral culture. They committed it to memory that way. And so they weren't so much interested in the how, the process, like scientists are. You know, we're talking about Big Bang and what was there before. That they were more interested in affirming that you might say that there was a creator, one creator, because every culture around them was polytheistic. There was a god for this and a god for that and so forth, and you had to appease them all. It was really complicated and expensive. So they're affirming one God who is the source of everything, the God. They were ridiculed for that. And how they came to that understanding, you know, that's part of their religious genius, is that insight was given to them, and it made them ultimately who they were, monotheists, with all kinds of implications once monotheism enters the human race. It helps to really integrate the psyche as well. It so so that's the more radical part of that revelation, is affirming the one God, the human place in the creation, the relationship between the human and God. In contrast to pantheism, the human and the creation are not God. They're a distinctly new kind of being that can be in relationship to God, who is with us, but who is also simultaneously totally other, which is not to say separate, it's more to say distinct. A God who is not separate, but who is distinct. They've got all that going on. They've got the seeds of that. I mean, it's really brilliant. And so, who was the first one that had that? When? We don't really know. Uh, First people we hear about in the scriptures, you know, Adam and Eve. Then later Abraham, who probably obviously was an historical person. Once you get to Abraham, you're dealing with human history and real people in the lineage who came after. Any other questions? Ilya, oh yeah, Ilya Delio refers to the whole story as our story, that we are not evolution, but that we are not in evolution, but that we are evolution. Please comment. Um, that was kind of what I was saying, and we'll say a lot more about in the next webinar, so I can start doing some commercials for that one. Where is that? I save these one point at a time. So, oh well. Yeah, so that in the human, um, evolution become conscious of itself in one of its creatures, awake to itself. Um, so the whole story is, yes, that's right. It, we are we are connected to everything, and to the whole process that came before has brought each one of us to where we are and who we are at this time. I mean, we have a tendency to kind of make ourselves into some little bubble that's isolated, but our DNA comes all the way back from those first single cell creatures. We have a connection all the way back to them. The thousands and, well, millions of years it took to make a cell, and then tissues and all of that, that's all just sort of part of our infrastructure. I mean, this is the way we operate as humans. We've inherited all of that. So each of us, you know, carries that whole history in our being. The air we breathe, everything else is breathing. The water that we drink is flowing through everything. We're just so profoundly connected. And we need to open up our noosphere. That's what's happening with these writings now, to really have an appreciation of that. Because it does take the mind to grasp that and appreciate it and open us to that. What is your interpretation of Teilhard's omega point? It sounds at some points like he is talking about God, or the logos, the pre-incarnate logos, the divine, you know, the divine presence that is bringing the creation forward, leading it within and into its future. So I think there's a divine aspect to it. It's kind of hard, for me at least, to just situate it in terms of one of the persons of the Trinity. There's a lot of really good discussion on that. It's a wonderful question, but it does show that he was grappling with that. How do we understand the divine at work in the creation, bringing the creation forward? Because the alternative explanation to evolution, and the one that many Christians are upset about, you know, those who are going to creationism or intelligent design, is this idea that this just all happened, and, you know, you can posit a theistic God who just made the universe and let it unfold like, you know, some sort of machine just doing its, you know, unwinding or clicking away. But it doesn't really account for God's presence much. And Teilhard is trying to put God right smack in the middle of it all. And that's where I see the genius of his omega point. Okay, I went to the Creation Museum when I lived in Cincinnati. Everything presented literally as in Genesis. Quite a display, but nothing scientific about it. Yeah, I know. You can look at it online. And there's another one, a Bible museum. I forget where that one is. Kentucky, maybe. Um, Amazing amount of money. I think the Hobby Lobby people are involved with that one, or maybe something else. But they're both fairly literalist in that sense, and so I mean, it's a fun museum to go to if uh, you want to see what a literal understanding of Genesis might look like. But no, it's nothing scientific about it. Not when you've got you know, a little dinosaur in the background with humans. The dinosaurs were gone tens of millions of years before humans showed up. Big money maker? Oh, Hebron, Kentucky. Yes, yes. Right, right. Well, we're getting close to the end. Any other questions or comments? Any of you have any other books you would like to recommend in addition to the ones that I put up there? I'll put them up there again, but if I know some of you have read uh, these topics. So let's see, let me get rid of the universe. Dennis Edwards has another one called How God Acts. That's worth reading. Ilia Delio was mentioned. What other books by her have some of you read? Because she's got several on this topic. And you can see some of these people, by the way, on YouTube. They are all good teachers. You can even see Teilhard de Chardin. So there are lectures by Dennis Edwards, Ilia Delio, Elizabeth Johnson, or parts of their lectures on the internet and on YouTube, and very, very good presentations worth listening to. All right. Well, next month we're going to do what does it mean to be pro-life, and you can see the direction we're moving. It's a little bit broader than just looking at abortion and euthanasia and questions like that. Um, going to look at the human as having a special place in the creation to assist in the responsibility of caring for and bringing forth life on earth. Um, Unpack that meaning from Genesis as more than just dominate the earth. What does it mean? What is the real meaning of that word dominate in terms of dominion, in terms of dominus, which is a word for God?